the room is very diverse. We have all components of reporters in the room, and that speaks to the need to use multiple channels to be able to disseminate climate information. And to dispel some of the existing misconceptions around climate change. I think in the morning you had one of the speakers mention that for quite some time, climate change has been construed to mean planting of trees or growing of trees as currently being put by the ministry. But there is more beyond just growing of trees. I think Ruth will speak briefly on the diversity of context around climate change. There is mitigation that is around planting of trees and a couple of other activities. There is also, there is mitigation, which is planting of trees and a couple of other things. There is also adaptation, which is direct opposite, but still having the same objective of just climate action. So recently I was engaging, engaging the media to traverse the country and speak to locals about some of the climate actions that they take. I think I'm seeing Rebecca in the room and a couple of guys that we've been with the field. There's a lot of climate action and activities taking place in our communities. There are solutions on the ground. But do you know that these people do not even know that the government probably is developing some policies, or trying to bring some funds to support their activities. But it is the role of the media, it is the role of journalists to be able to just unpack some of the national, global, regional discussions to these local communities. And I want to invite you, colleagues, to just go beyond the news. Let us go beyond the news. Let us inform, number one, educate, number two, but most importantly, engage our audiences, or people you call them, the readers, the viewers, listeners. Let us try and engage them. Let's understand what is their perspective, what is their roles, and that is missing. I'm happy that this partnership is being done with a learning institution as well, Daystar University, because then, if you look at the courses that exist in the institutions of higher learning, for example, the universities that train journalism, communication at very high levels, again, it is still really missing the technical aspects of many issues like climate change, health, agriculture. It's still very basic. And so we need to embed some of these technical skills in the national training curriculum. And so, as Jay said, I think we'll be very happy if we see that what began in this small room will escalate big to form part of our national training, to release the next group of journalists and reporters who are well informed, technically in climate language. Finally, I think you've been seeing in the media that GIZ has been supporting a number of programs that aims at informing, aims at transforming the communities to be able to take action. And one of them that is currently running, I think you've seen the clean cooking campaign that we're doing with almost all the media houses. You also saw us do the climate awareness through town halls in the recent past. And this really refers to our commitment to be able to just give the media the right space that it really belongs. We appreciate your role, and that is why we are here with you today and tomorrow. And after this, we'll be moving to, I think, Mombasa or Kisumu, and then later on to Kisumu for a similar activity. And why are we doing this? Again, is just to be able to impact from a point of amplifying actions, and most importantly from a point of engaging stakeholders to be able to, one, take action, two, also get involved. So I think with that, colleagues, I also want to invite Ruth. Ruth has been in this space for some time, and she will be able to speak some of this language better than I do, and also really set the pace for the next phase, which is to really identify the existing gaps that you have when reporting climate change. Ruth, please come. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kennedy. Good morning again. Let me reintroduce myself and provide some context into what we do. My name is Ruth Morane Masege. I work for an organization called the NDC Partnership. Anyone who's heard of the NDC? We are here to train and learn, and all of us are learning, right? So just be free, let's make it conversational, let's provide a context for ourselves. Anyone who's heard of an NDC? What is an NDC? What is an NDC?
Nationally determined contributions.
And what are they?
These are the efforts by the different governments towards combating climate change.
Yeah, thank you. And there's another word on targets. So to provide a context on what the NDC partnership is and which then translates to what the NDCs are, you all are aware of the Paris Agreement, right? Paris Agreement?
Yes.
This is under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Parties to the convention met in when was it, 2015. See, how many people went to COP21? Anyone in the room? Was that your one? Yeah, so in COP21 in Paris, parties met, and they were reviewing the global commitments and saying that from the science provided by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, we needed to cut our emissions globally significantly so that we reduce global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius and aim for a further reduction to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is the only pathway that gives us a chance to survive on this planet. This is very, very important information. And actually, when you look back at the whole science of climate change, and I'm happy that we are having editors, reporters. I don't know if we have reporters here. How many reporters do we have? Reporters. And the editors? Some even have more reporters than editors. There was an outcry earlier that we have more editors than reporters in the room. I'm happy that it's both, actually. When this agreement was signed in 2015, countries needed to provide their own, you call them efforts, and targets for reducing emissions in a document called a nationally determined contribution. And the reason why it's a nationally determined contribution is because, as you heard earlier from Wangi, we have different contexts. We are developing countries. We have countries in the south, we have countries in the north. And countries in the south have a very, very different context from countries in the north. And that's why, for us, our priority is development, but also food security. We want to feed our people. So reducing emissions is not really our priority. Adaptation and making sure that our communities have a resilience to climate change is our priority. So when we are giving our commitments to reducing emissions, we also have to look at the national context, but also ability of the economy to reduce the emissions in terms of the finances we have, in terms of the capacities, technical capacities we have, institutional capacities, but also the technology available. Because when you talk about reducing emissions, you also have to look at technology. It goes hand in hand, and the cost of these technologies. So Right after that COP, in COP 22, which happened in Morocco, under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, there was something launched called the NDC Partnership. It was launched by different governments. In the lead was the German government, together with the host of the COP, the government of Morocco, and the World Resources Institute. And the basis for this partnership was to ensure that it's actually a coalition of member states. We have developed countries and developing countries, and we are to ensure that developing countries are able to develop their NDCs. That was the initial plan. Develop their NDCs, their commitments, and submit to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, including providing the support that is required for implementation of the NDCs. Then slowly, over the years, because by around 2019, 2020 towards now 2020 deadline, most of the, when we needed to update our NDCs, most of the countries had submitted the initial NDCs. So the phase 2, we call it a phase 2 of the partnership. We are looking at resource mobilization for different member countries so that they're able to translate these big commitments that we have submitted to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change into actions that can be implemented at the national level, but also at the, especially at the local level, and ensure that we have financing for those actions. So how do we work? This is a country-driven process. We have 3 components which are very important. Maybe you need to understand. One is country engagement, where we provide coordination for all stakeholders. So we look at a whole of government approach, both the vertical and horizontal coordination between ministries and between the 2 levels of government. And then we also make sure that we are aligning partners to the financing or to the priorities of the NDCs. So when partners are coming up with new projects and programs, we try and ensure that those projects and programs are within the scope of our NDC. In our country commitment, we have taken a very serious, ambitious target. We want to reduce 32%. Initially, in our initial NDC, it was 30% of emissions by 2030. That's translated to about 40 to 41 million tons of CO2 equivalent per year. What that means is, if we do nothing, we don't mitigate, we don't evolve technology, we grow as a country. We are projected to get to 143 million tons of CO2 equivalent. But we say as a country, we are contributing, believe it or not, less than 0.1% of emissions. Less than 0.1% of the global emissions. It's negligent. And this is not just our situation, most countries in the south, but still, in the goodwill of the common good, for us to contribute to reduce our emissions further and say we will still grow, but we want to grow in a manner that is low, it's a low emissions, but ensuring that it's also a climate resilient growth trajectory. So we prioritize climate resiliency, but also we reduce our emissions using technologies and all that. We revised this contribution in 2020 when we updated the NDC to 32%. We need you media, and this is where you really come in. We need you to pick these targets and break them down into a narrative, a language that is easy to understand, that is able, we can relate to sectoral commitments. For instance, what does this mean to one of the most critical sectors, agriculture? In our country at the moment, agriculture is the biggest emitter of GHG emissions, greenhouse gases emissions, and this is because of the livestock. Methane has a very high global warming potential. So the more we are talking about livestock, we are talking about pastoralism, and it's a way of life for most of the communities. And these are the communities that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. What is the alternative? So these are the stories that I really like the discussion in the morning and the high level discussion and the presentations from Prof. And the PS and the remarks from Dr. Pacifica as well. We need to break down this content in a way that scientists cannot. And then there was the whole discussion on expertise in sectoral sectoral expertise, for instance. Do you have energy expertise? Does it really matter? Maybe we need to discuss. There can be partnerships. And this is where I see a very big role for you. You can engage with energy institutions, and you get to bring out the data, you get to bring out the stories, you get to amplify our climate change impacts, but also not just focusing on the impacts. We are doing a lot as a country, and most of it from our national budget, because the financing that is coming into climate change is very limited, and it's flowing to those sectors that are easy to finance, that have a business case. So we have an avenue through the NDC partnership. The first one I talked about is country engagement, where we provide the coordination for the implementation of the NDC. We also support in that country engagement the reporting back. Under the National Climate Change Act of 2016 that has been amended in 2023, there are duties to different entities. Public entities have duties, private sector have duties, even civil society have duties. If you look at, I think now it's section 20 from 24 or earlier, I don't know now the new amendments, the articles. But the duty is that for the ministries, departments, and agencies, for instance, they are mandated, a mandate, they are required to report annually on progress of implementation of climate action. The same to private sector, the same to civil society. These duties, because as you are aware, we should be having a National Climate Change Council, which has not been, it has been established but has never had one meeting as yet because of different challenges. But this report should provide feedback to the Council on progress of implementation at national and local level of our NDC, but also our National Climate Change Action Plan. There was a question earlier that I really liked. It was about the Climate Change Act and how far have we gone into implementing it. Since we launched the 2016 Climate Change Act, and by the way, we are one of the countries, I think it's the first country in Africa that has had a legislative focus on just climate change. This is very, very important because it has provided that visibility, but also even establishing a National Climate Change Council. How many councils do we have in the country? Anyone who knows? National councils. We only have one council that is chaired by the president, and that's the Security Council. This is the second council established by law that is to be chaired by the president. And this shows the significance of climate change in the country. The impacts of climate change to our economy cannot be overstated. And we usually talk of 3 to 5% impact to the economy, but this is a very outdated report. It was done in 2009 by the Stockholm Environment Institute. We need an updated review of the impacts of climate change. When you look at the locusts, for instance, the prolonged droughts, how does this impact the sectors and how does this impact the livelihoods at the local level? This is a study and a gap, for instance, that has been identified. But also we need you to tell us this information. Ask the government the questions so that this can be updated and can inform further policy development. On the second component, for the partnership, we foster engagement. Fostering engagement is in the National Climate Change Action Plan. This is a tool that is identified by the National Climate Change Act, 5-year iterative tool for implementing our NDC. We communicate globally that we want to reduce our emissions, but what does that mean locally? Ministry of Environment leads the development or coordinates the development of a National Climate Change Action Plan. We have had two action plans so far since 2018, and now we are in the third National Climate Change Action Plan. You remember during the Africa Climate Summit, there was a launch of the National Climate Change Action Plan. For the 5 years, this is a tool that you need to be presented to as media so that you can use to check government's action on climate change, because it's a requirement of the Act that we implement this, but also, as I mentioned, there are duties to mainstream climate change action planning and report back on progress of implementation. We need to to foster engagement with media, we need to foster engagement with private sector and civil society. There's an avenue, we usually coordinate meetings with development partners, and now I'm thinking there's even an avenue of engaging the media and bringing them to the discussion, to the table, of saying, providing that gatekeeping, yeah, and providing the checks and balances with government. So I see that as an opportunity for us through the partnership to engage with media. And then lastly, we have an avenue for knowledge and learning. You can check our NDC partnership online portal. There is a lot of content that is trying to break down the difficult lingua on climate change into simple languages. I can also share materials with the Kenya Editors Guild on climate change, on international negotiations, for those that are wanting to learn more, but also it can provide content for the curriculum that is going to be built. In our country, if you look at the history of climate change, when you talk about knowledge and learning, when I got into climate change, that was in 2012, is when I started. There were a few people like this who used to be in the climate change discussion, very few people. And it was mostly under this United Nations Framework Convention, this COPs. It was very, very few people who are in the COPs discussion. And towards the end of the year, you see there's a Kidogo movement around climate change, and it was very, very difficult. If you're not a scientist in climate change, it used to be very difficult languages to understand, even just to understand the UNFCCC processes. How many have been to a COP, at least even one? What do you usually follow? Which track? You follow everything. Yes. Is there anyone who has specialized a track at the UNFCCC that they follow? For media, it's important that you follow everything, but sometimes following everything in COP can be following nothing. That's just the reality. When I went for my first COP, I felt like it was a marketplace. Because nobody tells you, this is the room to go, this is the interest, this you follow finance, you hear your president has gone to this. You see Ghana has a side event on, I don't know what brand. At the end of the day, if you take stock, you are following nothing. And this is also what needs to be broken down into climate change reporting. You need to specialize. If you want to focus on climate finance, that's a very big opportunity. Start learning on the climate financial discussion, especially from the international under the UNFCCC processes, the commitments that have been there. What was promised by the developed countries? Where are we with that target? What are we demanding for? Ask the government, how much money have we received? From which sources? We have very different sources of financing. We have sources, maybe from governments, like the German government, Denmark, and all that. We have multilaterals. And in what formats? You'll be very surprised that, for instance, the program we are talking about in the morning, financing of locally led action. This was a program that was designed to be a grant, a full grant, and a design. It went to World Bank and it came back as a loan. And the focus is to finance adaptation. These are the questions that we can be talking about. So, of the finances we received, which one are grants, which one, and where is which sectors, where we are funding. So these are the questions that if you are a climate, you want to be a climate finance reporter, these are the questions you can ask. Energy, agriculture, forestry, industry, waste, and manufacturing. The issues that are manufacturing are completely different from the issues in agriculture. The politics under agriculture, for instance, because there's a whole discussion on how do we ensure food security for countries that are developing and vulnerable to rain-fed agriculture, for instance, and balance that with reducing emissions from those same sectors. At the same time, you're talking of countries, developed countries who want to cut significantly, cut emissions from the agriculture sector. They could afford to do that. Can we afford to do that? Can we say, for instance, we reduce the growth of livestock in the country? Livestock is providing not just food, but is also providing significant jobs to a lot of communities. So those are the discussions. The issues in energy are very different. Where do we find financing for renewable energy? For instance, you go to South Africa, and I'm digressing a bit, but it's really important for you to understand that climate change reporting is really, really broad, and you have to specialize in a way. You might not be the expert, but you can get interested in a topic. You go to South Africa, there's a whole discussion on energy, just and equitable energy transition. As much as for us in Kenya, we have over 90, last year it dropped, we have about 89% of renewables in our grid. In South Africa, it's the reverse. It's, I think, about 90% is from fossil fuels, from coal. How do you tell a country that is still qualified as developing, how do you tell them to transition to green when they cannot even power their economy with the fossil fuels they have? So those are the questions, and they were able to package a very good deal for themselves, and they went to COP. This was COP 26, you remember? And they got a very big package from there, and at that whole discussion, they got money to finance their just and equitable energy transition. Mostly grants, but some of it also loans. So those are the questions. Media has a lot of, a big opportunity to even shape conversations nationally and internationally. Forestry issues, there was a question earlier around carbon markets. Let me shock you. As much as we have a big forestry target, we still have significant emissions from our forestry sector. How do we balance that with carbon markets? A lot of people are planting trees, but it's not just plant a tree and expect credits. There's a whole discussion on methodologies for forestry sector. Since we started carbon markets in the country, forget about this new regime of the Paris Agreement. Under the Kyoto Protocol, we had a previous regime. I mean, this is now, I get again into the whole lingua, but under the previous regime, before the Paris Agreement, we had the CDM. That was a compliance market established for trading. And most of the projects we had in that regime, in Kenya, none of them actually is from the forestry sector, because of that whole discussion. So we need to look at what are the issues, how can we benefit as a country, and in which sectors we need to investigate. But at the same time, engage with government. And I was discussing earlier, I was hoping that government would be here to provide a presentation, to set the scene, to provide the legislations, to engage with you on carbon markets and where we are with as a country. And then based on that, you can identify areas and gaps for reporting. But I really, really look forward to a very good deliberation. We are very open to through the NDC partnership. We receive requests through the government. So for instance, if there's a need to engage with media and amplify or talk about climate positive reporting in the country, we can receive a request from a media organization or through an association for media, through the focal point, which is the Ministry of Environment. Dr. Pacifica is our focal point, and it goes to the partnership. The partnership sends this to all partners under the partnership. Right now we have over 124 partners, both developed countries, implementing agencies, international organizations, and that request then we look for funding. Then through that, we give again response to the government and say we have funding for this, and we support this. It can be either direct funding or the partner that is providing the funding engages with the institution that is providing the request to implement. So I think there are many ways of fostering engagement, and members of the fourth estate, there's a lot of power when it comes to climate change. It's just about enhancing capacities, providing skills, but also specialization to know how to provide, how to tell these stories. When I was listening to Prof earlier, he was actually storytelling. For me, it was very interesting because he was reviewing all the issues that are there around reporting in a way that is easy to understand. And this is a power that you have, a gift that you have that scientists might not have. So there's need for partnership so that we can provide visibility and enhance the resilience of our communities as the end goal. Thank you. Thank you. Now we go back to the abbreviations. I'm sorry. The CDM is so under the Kyoto Protocol, it was set differently. and that's why it needed to be reviewed. Developed countries had targets to reduce their emissions, but developing countries did not have targets. Under that framework, each of the developed countries have targets. They created a clean development mechanism. It's like a compliance market for engaging. If you're able to supersede, and this is how carbon markets works. If, for instance, you have a carbon emission reduction target, and you exceed your target, that means you have excess emissions, you're able to trade, you're able to sell to another country that does not meet their targets. So it's a compliance market that is governed by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that enables the trading of credits between different countries. But it was mostly to enable the developed countries to also get credits from developing countries because their targets were very stringent, yet developing countries had opportunities for reducing emissions and they did not have targets so that they could sell credits to the developed countries. The whole Kyoto Protocol failed in a way because most developed countries felt that developing countries also needed to be part of the discussion. And that is why in the Paris Agreement, it's all parties under the United Nations Framework Convention are bound to reducing emissions.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Let's clap for Ruth. One thing that has caught my attention that personally I had not thought about is that even within climate change, you need to specialize. I thought that if you are just a climate change reporter then, or an editor, you have reached where you're supposed to go. So, have you heard about the climate change financing? And I think that is why such forums are very important because they educate you even more than you expected to be educated. And we appreciate what you've shared and the role NDC is doing. And I was very happy to hear somebody knows that NDC, what it means, nationally determined contributions and what they do. And I think that is the knowledge and the research we should be doing a lot back in our newsroom so that even when we are reporting, we report from very informed positions. And the role of breaking targets to something that can be understood. And I think for us here, that is our biggest role. How do we break these complex scientific things to things that my mother back at home will easily understand? How can I explain climate change to my grandmother? And how can I explain to my grandmother or my mother that the 50 cows or the 20 cows she's keeping are contributing to climate change? How do you even start? And I think that is where our conversations should begin. And I'm happy that we are headed towards that direction of how do we break these complex things to things that our people can understand, and how do we even break them to languages that they understand. When I'm here, I can understand the English, yes, but do I understand how do I break, or how do I transition now from the English I know to a language that the ordinary person on the ground understands? And that is why even the role of community radio stations come in. I don't know if I should open up for one or two questions. I can see a hand already up. Probably we'll take a few questions. I know Ruth will have many questions. So we'll pass the mic around, a few questions, then we move to the next sessions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Helen Shikanda from the Nation Media Group. Thank you, Ruth, for your presentation. And when you were talking about NDCs, you mentioned different sectors and how they plug in or contribute to NDCs, and you mentioned agriculture, and then you went ahead and mentioned methane, and then even more relatable, you mentioned how pastoralists and basically how cows contribute to methane emission. I'd like to know what Kenya is doing in terms of cutting down methane emissions. in that sector so that our NDCs can be kept in check, especially in regards to methane. And then my second question is in regards to the global methane pledge that was signed last year and Kenya was a signatory. I'd like to know what does it mean for a common mwananchi who has never heard about the global methane pledge. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, and also tell us what is methane in Swahili if I want to go and report in Swahili. Any other question?
Okay.
Yes, please.
My name is Pauline Ongaji, also from Nation. I don't think it's a question. Mine is just some clarification to Ruth. It's good to specialize, especially as a climate journalist, but then we must understand that most of our media organizations are not well funded to cover even climate stories. When you go to COP, sometimes it's not your media organization has taken you there. So it will become difficult for you to specialize in one area, especially when covering COP. Yet, perhaps you are the only journalist from your media organization there. You have to look for different events taking place so that you are able to cover different stories for that event. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks for that question. Issues of funding in newsrooms and how they challenge specialization. There's another question here. Then we allow Ruth to come and respond to them.
Nitauliza swali kwa Kiswahili. Kukosekana kwa baraza la mabadiliko tabia nchi ambalo lilibuniwa lakini kuna kesi iko mahakamani. Hili baraza ikiwa halipo sasa hivi inamaanisha nini, hususan katika mikakati ya NDCs, na wao ni mmoja wa wale ambao wanafaa kuziangalia hizi NDCs kila wakati.
Asante, na tunatarajia swali hilo kujibiwa kwa lugha ya Kiswahili, sababu tukitoka hapa tunarudi mashinani kuwaeleza wanaotusikia wanaotusikiza kwa lugha ambayo wanaelewa. Kuna swali lingine la mwisho ili Ruth akuze pale, then tumalizie na hapa.
Okay, thank you for the presentation, Madam Ruth. My name is Morris Otieno from Radio Waumini. My concern would just be what your organization is doing, particularly focus on the smaller radios in the community, because for these objectives to be achieved, I mean, those small radios that talk in vernacular must be brought into the game. I started reporting about climate change way back in 2009 with the help of UNEP then, and then when Akim Steiner, who was the general, the boss at UNEP left, everything went down. But our focus on the smaller radios. At that time, there were not so many, but today we have quite a number of smaller radios across the country. If you have to achieve the objective, then those radios must be brought into play. Is there any plan that you're going to include these small radios, most of the community radios, into this program of training, so that those journalists have the capacity to deliver this technical jargon from the scientists to the local person? Thank you.
Thank you. We have one, and then we end this corner.
Thank you. My name is Crispinas Juma. Allow me to interrogate you a little bit on carbon trading. You have mentioned that we have so many, kind of protocols on how to go about carbon trading. But as it is today, the understanding is that for you to engage in carbon trading, then, the first thing to go to is to think about afforestation. I understand there are other avenues, but again, given the circumstance at the moment, you see we don't have the Climate Change Council, in as much as maybe it's something in the offing. But how then do we make it more understood to our audience that this is a venture that they can, get into, and how best can they go about it? Because it's like everybody doesn't understand what this carbon trading is, and even how to go about it, who is selling the carbon, or all those things. Will you just kind of give an overview of what this is for my normal listener back in Musutwe or wherever?
Okay, thank you very much. We come to the last one here, and also I'm very interested. Have we made any money so far?
Yeah, thank you. I think the radio people, we have so many complaints. So just to say this is what I want to say. You see, the climate change is mostly affecting areas like Garissa, Wajir, Mandera, Marsabit, Isiolo, the northern part of the country. So the government is doing good work in declaring, national disaster in floods and the droughts. But to go on the ground and to convince that old man, my grandfather, who has 100 camels, who sees that camels as a pride, he has a say in the community. That's what he gives as a bridegroom, the price when he's looking for a lady to marry. To tell him to do insurance on those camels or to reduce, I don't think it will work. Or to convince the charcoal burner who is feeding his child to go to school or to buy clothes, stop charcoal burning, it's affecting climate change. And also you see the media, the local radio station, he was talking about the language they understand. Majority of the Somali, the literacy, it's very high, their illiteracy. Those pastoralists, they don't carry the TV stations when they're looking after their camels or cows. Neither do they buy or do they understand Swahili or English, but they can understand the local radio station which use the vernacular Somali radio station. While some of us, we were denied to cover the climate summit, the communication officer is here for the department. We were denied the entrance to cover the climate change summit in Nairobi, KICC, because the local vernacular radio stations like Wanatarauli, they have no space in this. So I think it will be very difficult we cannot talk of storytelling to communities, the injustice in the communities, and still we don't want to empower those local radio stations.
Thank you very much, Ruth. You have quite a number of issues to address. Karibu sana.
I'll pass up to the ministry officials here.
I think the ministry is only one why they locked community radio stations.
Communications, all questions can go there.
Karibu sana.
Thank you. I'll try to answer. Let me also say I'm not going to be able to answer all questions perfectly. I'll try to answer the ones that I can manage. We are all in it to learn, right? But there are questions that are quite direct, and I really like the question that came about methane. Methane is a very hot topic when it comes to climate. They were trying to push for a significant cut in the global methane emissions. I think it was up to 30%. And by 2030, there's reasoning for that. Methane, as I mentioned, is a highly potent gas, and it's global warming potential, which means it's a heavy gas. It retains the whole discussion around global warming, and I've seen a very interesting, what is climate change? So I think all this is going to be covered here. But global warming is basically a blanket of greenhouse. You see the way greenhouse gases behave, yeah? Once you get in, it's warm. There's some heat that is trapped. So because of these gases, we have more heat that is trapped than what is going back into the atmosphere. And methane has a higher global warming potential than even carbon dioxide. And that's why there was this urgent push to cut down methane emissions. But for developing countries, and even in our whole discussion on our NDC, because we gave that 32%, reduction, but sectorally we broke it down and said this amount of the 43 million tons, 32 translates 46 million tons, of the 46 million tons of CO2 equivalent, this amount should come from agriculture, this amount should come from forestry, this amount should come from industry, this one from transport and all that. For the agriculture sector, there are some options that have been proposed. For instance, improving, how does methane come about? And I saw someone from ILRI, they can also be part of this discussion. During the ruminants, when they're chewing cud, you see them, it's called regurgitation. They remove your belching, they release that methane. But if you improve the yields, the food they eat, you're able to enhance digestion and you reduce the amount of emissions, the methane emissions they produce. We did not propose reducing the livestock because for the country, and this ties again to the question that was asked about these communities in Mandera, Garissa, Wajir and all that. There is that significant cultural attachment to livestock. But also we are looking at livestock under the lens of food security and the jobs they provide. And considering over 80% of the land is arid or semi-arid. So we are really left with very little land. And this is also increasing. We are left with very little land for agricultural productivity. So the options that we are pushing for is improving agricultural productivity without necessarily cutting down the livestock. And that is why we say we have a common problem, but we have differentiated responsibilities. What does that mean? We have a common global crisis, climate change. But our responsibilities are very different. We have contributed less than 0.1% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. Our responsibilities should be to adapt, because once we have catastrophic events, we are the worst hit, because our resilience index, we don't have that ability to adapt as the economies in the north, the developed countries have. You see them once they have wildfires, their governments step in a minute. They evacuate people, they host them, they do that. You see, when we have a catastrophic droughts and floods, we do national mchango for that. So we have very differentiated capabilities to respond to the impacts of climate change. And that's why, even in our NDCs, when we are looking at sectoral strategies, we are also looking at strategies that are enhancing, as it was stressed in the morning, enhancing our adaptive capacity as a country and ensuring that the economies have the priority, food security. Number one, on the National Climate Change Action Plan, the one that I mentioned, and it would really have been good if we could also have talked about the plan and for you to understand what the government is talking about. Every 5 years, there is an action plan with priorities in all the sectors that need to be implemented. The priority number one is disaster risk reduction and management, DRRM. Why is that so? Because it's unfortunate, but we are reactive most of the time, not all the time. Even with the advisory that was given the other day, when was it? 2 months or 1 month ago, it was given an advisory of the March, April, May rainfall. We know that we knew that we were going to receive above average rainfalls in different parts of the country. But what is the government doing about it, or what is our capacity to even proactively respond to that advisory? So the early warning systems might be there, although we still have inadequate capacity in that regard. Our response needs to be more proactive than reactive. So when we are talking about strategies, we also take into cognizance the context. But at the same time, let me skip the ones on communication and hand over that to Temesi and Kennedy. I wanted to link that to the question you talked about local languages and ensuring the understanding at the local level. Honestly, this is a challenge. And I think the government has that, let me be a bit subjective. I think the government provides the vision setting, provides the policies, provides the action plans. I think this is also now an opportunity for media. But how is media enabled to do that? That will be the question. So these are the things that you can identify in this room and seek partnerships. I mentioned partnerships. Partnerships are very important. We have civil society organizations that do a lot of advocacy. They're also doing training. PACJA, for instance, there's also the Friedrich Heydrich, the German one. They're doing a lot of advocacy on communication on climate change. There can be partnerships that can enhance engagements with local media and ensuring that this is going down to the local communities. But that said and done, let me also be now objective. The whole discussion on climate change as a country, we have not really gone far. This started in 2009, unfortunately. Our first national response to climate change was in 2010. Before it used to be, that's what I'm telling you, it used to be a feat for the few. Up until 2009, we had a La Nina. When was that, 19? When was La Nina? Anyone? Good enough to remember?
1997.
We had 1997, that was El Nino. 97, 98 was El Nino. Then we had a La Nina earlier, 1990, then another one, a big one in 85. We had catastrophic events, but we had not had any national discussion on climate change. It was the very first report done by the Stockholm Environment Institute on climate change, on the impacts of climate change on the economy. It was done from the Oxford office, but with a lot of partnerships on the ground, that reflected we have up to 5% impacts of climate change on the economy. And this then woke up the government to this whole engagement on climate change. They developed the very first legislative document, the Climate Change Response Strategy. And the goal of that strategy at that time was trying to look at understanding climate change, because there was this global regional discussion on climate change, but it had not really gotten to the national level. So even understanding the global in negotiations, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and what those results from the IPCC studies or reports meant for Kenya. And then, of course, setting the pace for further action. I could have another session discussing our story, but what I'm trying to say is that we also have to be a little bit understanding of our journey on climate change. It's now the impacts and effects are significantly being felt, but nationally we have not had a very long engagement on climate change as other economies. However, now you can imagine, we even have a training on media for climate change. It is progressive, the speed needs to be, it's an urgent issue, we need to move faster. So I'm just mentioning so that you can see, I think this is a good start. We now need to know how do we engage and go to the grassroots. And these are the strategies media can provide, options media can provide. And let me promise you, I think there's also a lot of funding on this topic. If it's properly packaged, it can be presented to partners and you can get partnerships to engage communities on climate change. Up until last year I was with GIZ for the actually most of my GIZ career was only on climate change. And I know with a surety, partners can engage with local media stations. There's a big project on cooking called GCF, Green Climate Fund. It's funded from the GCF funds, and they're engaging local media stations. And maybe Kennedy can talk about what they do there, but it's really bringing out this whole discussion, trying to incentivize a transition from the three-stone fire to improve cooking technologies and all that. And we can package something like that and look for partnerships for funding. Sorry for going into that. The other one is on, I think I have one more left. No. The council, before I continue, yes, there's still a court a case in court. It's a very unfortunate situation, but these are things that we have to wait for the process to end. It does not deter implementation of the National Climate Change Act. Implementation is ongoing. And the biggest part on implementation is, as I mentioned, reporting. The Act establishes climate change units in all ministries, departments, agencies, requires the counties to also establish their own climate change units. And this, because of the FLOCA program, the funding was one of the prerequisites for them to get funding. Counties are now significant. Almost all counties have established their climate change units. They have personnel in the counties. They're implementing climate action. It is the reporting back that now we need to enhance and ensure that climate action is being reported to the national level. Once it goes to the Ministry of Environment, specifically the Climate Change Directorate, they publish the annual reports. They can be accessible online, and then you can see how far we've gone. However, I also understand that the fact that we don't have a council, there are some things that cannot progress because the council has a mandate. Part of the mandate is giving direction on climate policy, giving direction on resource mobilization and such. So there's also that still a gap, but we have to wait for the process to end. Lastly, I have one, I hope I've covered most. I'll hand over the communications to you. Methodologies, so carbon trading, afforestation is usually, it's just understood basically as one of the sectors where we have the biggest opportunities. People think you plant a tree. I agree, there's need for a lot of capacity building on carbon trading, and that can be another session. Maybe it can be featured in one of the, the curricula that you're developing, basics of carbon trading. But as a country, and Pacific alluded to that, or I think it's a PS, the sectors we need to trade carbon in. Carbon finance is an opportunity for financing our climate action, just like any other. But it's a very tedious process, and even to develop a carbon project, it takes a very long time. Because you need to understand the methodologies under which you're going to ensure that you're cutting your emissions. There's a verification process through the standard you're using. We can discuss that in another session. But the sectors, as you mentioned rightfully, afforestation is not the only opportunity we have. We have sectors in energy, around clean cooking. Actually, majority of the projects we've had so far on carbon trading are under clean cooking. We have had projects under water purification using clean energy, that's using solar. We have had projects around transport now is really growing, although transport is difficult because of the heavy investments in e-mobility, but it's a growing sector. We have very interesting opportunities around industry, enhancing energy efficiency in the industry sector so that we reduce energy use and also maybe replace the fossil fuels where possible, because industry also needs a lot of energy, which is mostly from fossil fuels, but we can reduce using where possible. So there are other opportunities in other sectors, and the government is going to develop a white list. What a white list basically is technologies and sectors under which you can trade, you can develop carbon projects. There are carbon regulations, carbon markets regulations that are in draft. I'm sure most of you maybe were engaged during the public participation process. And these ones, once operationalized, will also provide further procedures on how to develop carbon projects, where to go to government for approvals and all that. So it's about the basics of carbon trading. Yes, there's a lot of misinformation on it. A lot of communities, for instance, and I'm hoping that it's not true, but it could be true. People think you plant trees and you look for someone to develop credits for it. Do you know those trees, you cannot do anything on your land? Or maybe there's that lack of information that once you plant trees on your 20, 50, 60 acres of land, you cannot remove those trees for so many years. They have to be, there's the element of permanence. They have to be there. So si unapanda tu alafu zikimea zikimaliza unakata unapanda mahindi. Now tell me, for local farmers who are coming together with their small pieces of land aiming to plant trees for carbon credits, where will they get sourcing for? Where do they get their agricultural land from? Where do they get their crops from? So this is the information around methodologies that needs to be also given out. And maybe I really think that it can form part of the curriculum. Carbon trading and reporting on opportunities on carbon trading. Thank you.
Let's appreciate Ruth. Thank you very much, Ruth. We are slightly about 30 minutes to lunch break. But before we take the lunch break, I would like to invite Dr. John Recha. He is the lead curriculum developer and the lead trainer. Karibu.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Yes, John Recha is my name. I have been in the field of climate change research for 20 years now. And I basically undertake research by looking at past records of how the climate has changed in a given country, in a given ecosystem, and then we also work with other scientists to project into the future, the year 2030, 2050, 2100, how the trend is on how climate will change by that time. Then we use that information to be able to inform other researchers on possible scenarios of what will happen, so that this is used to be able to come up with solutions by different entities on how to be able to respond to the changing climate. So specifically, I work with an institution called the International Livestock Research Institute, not as a livestock scientist, but as a scientist in climate change, covering all sectors of climate change, although with a bias in agriculture. But then, even with that, we provide information that can be used in other sectors. Now, where I'm hosted, it is simply a regional headquarter of a research group that works in the entire IGAD and SADC region in terms of research on climate change, and specifically informing what will be the most appropriate actions related to agriculture that can be done in what we call climate smart agriculture that can help in dealing with this challenge. So for a start, I'll say I want us to refresh ourselves on what is climate change, where I've gone to in different countries and different audiences. When we speak about this, there is sometimes a lack of understanding. My most favorite, one of my most favorite statements I normally hear when I'm in workshops like this or in meetings, people say, please open the windows so that the climate can come. As a scientist, you just laugh and say, oh my goodness, these people need to know the terms. Because when you're talking about these terms and with the climate change field, it is supposed to be like that altogether. And even as I'm talking, yes, I think it's becoming hot. We may need to do something like that to have the climate come in. Yes, Mr. Luke. Good. So, next slide. One term that I also hear, which sometimes I laugh at, is when we talk about the greenhouse effect or greenhouse gases. Many times when I ask people, when you hear greenhouse, what do you think? They say, hey, hizi greenhouse watu wanatumia kwa ajili ya kupanda sijui mimea gani, hizi ndio zinaharibu, zinachangia sana, wachana greenhouse. So then, I thought that is a typical farmer. Until one day I was having a journalist, and actually a Kenyan journalist, talking to me. And then he said, I want to have a feature, produce a document about climate change. So then I saw what he had produced. And when the time came to show greenhouse gases, it was actually a greenhouse. The one used for crop production. I told him, no, please. May I advise you on how this should be done? And then I realized, yes, a lot of terms are actually confusing here altogether. Next. Ladies and gentlemen, let's go a little bit into some basic science of primary school or physics in secondary school. Basic, for you to understand a little bit what climate change is all about. Now, when you wake up in the morning, and one thing that I like is I like seeing the sun come out, and I purposefully, when I was trying to rent houses and before I build mine, I want to be sure that my bedroom faces the sun's rise so that it helps to wake me up. What happens when the sun's rays are coming from the sun and they're hitting the earth's surface? Ladies and gentlemen, we call that solar radiation. That radiation, when it comes, it has to pass through the atmosphere from the outer space and then it comes to the earth. So when you look at this, you'll see some arrows coming and then some going back altogether. This is what happens. That radiation that comes, when it's passing through the atmosphere, little bit of it, in science, it's been documented about 23%, is absorbed by that atmosphere. And then another percentage comes to hit the Earth's surface. What hits the Earth's surface, half of it is absorbed by the Earth, whether it's a water body or a land body. And then 30% of it, 30% of radiation, ends up getting reflected back into the atmosphere. That 30% of the radiation is what we are now focusing on in climate change. That 30% that is reflected back into the atmosphere is supposed to pass through the atmosphere and go into the outer space. But then, now, that is where we have the greenhouse gases coming in. Why? Because most of that 30% doesn't get back into the outer space. As it is reflected to go back into outer space, most of it is absorbed by the greenhouse gases that are around the Earth's surface. Therefore, it leads to a net effect of an environment which is becoming hotter. So, the relationship between the greenhouse gases and the typical greenhouse is this. When you walk into a typical greenhouse, what will you feel in most cases? Hot. Hence, we use the word greenhouse gas effect or greenhouse effect. Now, next slide. That is simply the same illustration. From the sun, comes to the Earth's surface, whether it's water mass or land body, absorbed, 30% of it back altogether. Some of it is captured around before it hits the atmosphere by greenhouse gases, and then it is radiated back into the earth, and therefore it now causes that effect of hotness being there. Next. Now, we have mentioned this, previous speakers, the greenhouse gases, the carbon dioxide, the methane has been mentioned. This one called nitrous oxide. Of course, from what Ruth has mentioned here, plus other colleagues, methane comes about mostly through what? Yes, you are saying something. Through livestock. Not all livestock, specifically the ones called ruminants, many stomachs. When they end up eating food, they eat non-stop. When they rest, now they start doing the digestion. They regurgitate, it's called a card. That burp sound that you hear is 99% methane, which goes into the atmosphere. As mentioned by my colleague Ruth, it is actually far more lethal. It has got more ability to absorb this radiation, far much more than carbon dioxide. However, that I will mention a little bit about the proportion of these gases. Now, how does carbon dioxide come about in most cases? Yes, we are also learning in class. How does carbon dioxide come about? Most of the time? Yes? Through? Combustion. Okay, thank you. Yes, any other way? Charcoal burning. I'm getting it. Yes. Cars, petrol. Yes. It comes about through the various sectors. In the transport sector, the planes and the cars that we have, and the ships in the oceans, they emit out of carbon dioxide, of course. Then there is building and construction. A lot of CO2 is emitted. Then in agriculture, which comes about in most cases through what has been mentioned here, cutting down of the trees. So in the field of agriculture, when sometimes we hear people say, and we also hear this announced sometimes by our distinguished officers saying, we have expanded the area under agriculture in this place from 1,000 hectares to 2,000 hectares, and we will be able to have a doubling effect of the yields. That is not being smart. The way we are producing food in our country, we are using very basic, conventional, and sometimes rudimentary methods, and we don't even reach the potential yield of most of what we produce as cash crops and even food crops. We can double the yield per unit area without necessarily increasing the area that is under cultivation. So most of our contribution towards the greenhouse gas emissions, as mentioned by my previous speaker, is especially through agriculture. Now, those are the main ones. Next. This is the greenhouse effect in terms of contribution of the different gases. Carbon dioxide takes 2/3 of the contribution to greenhouse gas activities, and the methane is 17%, then nitrous oxide is 6%, and the other gases. Nitrous oxide comes about through very poor manure management or poor use of fertilizer. That is still through agriculture. And also, for example, nitrous oxide actually comes about from the term nitrogen gas related to what we call nitrate. When you hear the fertilizer called diammonium phosphate, DAP, being applied into the soil altogether, that ammonium is the nitrogen. Now, when we are producing some specific crops under an environment that's flooding, like flood irrigation, to produce rice, what typically happens there is that as you apply the fertilizer there, because it is flooded, in basic science, once there is flooded, what happens to aeration or to the levels of oxygen in that area? They become very minimal. So that basically means it is what we call anaerobic conditions. Under those conditions with less oxygen, or the anaerobic conditions, some specific bacteria will convert that fertilizer that you have applied and make it turn into air. It's called fertilization. And therefore, that's how it comes about. Now, when you put carbon dioxide together with methane, and then of course you put nitrous oxide, you're getting about over 90% of the emissions. And that's now what we are dealing with here. Next. Now, what is the effect of that? I therefore want to focus more on the carbon dioxide emissions, ladies and gentlemen. In carbon dioxide emissions, in science, when I get back to the statement I said about climate, in science, we can only accept data that is a minimum of 30 years from any given place around temperature or rainfall or any of the variables around climate for us to be sure that actually the climate has changed. So, if you end up hearing someone talk about ati climate imebadilika tu kabisa, hata mwaka jana mvua ilikuwa inanyesha ikianza wakati huu na saa hizi imeanza wakati huu. He's talking about the effects, but not the real science. In the science of climate change, we get data from meteorological stations, and then we analyze it for 30 years minimum. Then we get an average trend of each to be able to say, yes, this is the trend that is there. So we've done that for Kenya, done for other parts of Africa, that done that in the world. I want to just project onto you a typical scenario in the world for you to understand, because this is also how it is in Kenya. If you look at this, not very clear. Are you able to put it on presentation mode for me? Click. Let me show you. The last one. Yes. Hapa mwisho. Aha. I think the computers. Yes. Click on that. Alafu. Yes. Yes, that's how it's supposed to be. Thank you very much. Now, if you look at this, when you go up to there about 1900, you will see where the yellow and I think bluish color are starting to increase. Globally, the factories, industries that are there began getting more enhanced around the year 1900, and then from there, the First World War. By the time we get to the Second World War, there were more factories in Europe and elsewhere. As they end up increasing in terms of output, then the carbon dioxide levels began increasing. With the increase in carbon dioxide levels altogether, the year 2018, this was the year 2018, that is how it has been. The CO2 levels have increased significantly, and as mentioned by previous speakers here, the European Union, United States, and China are the biggest culprits in actually emitting this CO2. But of course, we are more affected. I will come to that. Next. With the CO2 increase, this is the typical actual increase in temperature globally. It's an average. It started from the 1880, 1900, 1920 to the year 2000. And what you see is a 1 degree Celsius increase in temperature globally in a period of 100 years. Now, you may end up saying, 100 years? Quite negligible, yes, altogether. But then, there is something I would like you to be able to relate to, understand here. It is 1 degree Celsius increase in temperature. Let me ask you a question. When each one of us may have had malaria, I've had a number of times. When they take the measurements, how much in terms of degree Celsius increase do they need in the hospital to just make sure that you have malaria? Typically, what is our body Yes, and then for them to say that they've got high temperature, they've got fever, is normally what? Actually, all that's required is 0.1 or 0.05 degree Celsius increase in temperature, and then you are told that you've got fever. What that means when with the fever, it is by 0.5 degrees Celsius increase. It starts bringing about effects of malfunctioning of the body parts, the kidneys, the liver, the organs of the body. Now, similarly, when there is an increase in temperature outside here globally, it also reflects in the increase in temperature around you and it can affect your body. And there are many, many effects that are there around that. Let me give you an example also as I talk about this. Sure, the next slide. With this temperature rise, now that's the median. You see there's a trend of increase, and it began specifically from 1940s onwards. And where we are 2018, it is still increasing. Next. Yeah, just click on next also. Now, this is also a global map. A graph from the globe around the wide number of droughts, floods, storms, and extreme temperature events that have been there from the year 1900 to the year 2017. What you will see here, ladies and gentlemen, is from around 1940 to 1950, these events have been increasing. That variability is there. So what does that mean? Let me come back to what my colleague from PACJA talked about as how the climate change affects Africa far much more different than it does in Europe and the Americas or the global north. We are blessed to be in a country where the equator passes right in the middle of Kenya. Now, you and me know that depending on which place you are in Kenya, first of all, about 80% of Kenya is either arid or semi-arid. 20% is what is called category 1. Then secondly, we can be able to produce crops all around the year if the arid is irrigation, or if there is rainfall in the first rainy season and the second season in the course of the year. What happens in Europe? When do they produce their crops? And the Americas? How many seasons? One. The reason being the temperature. During the snow moments altogether, the crops cannot grow. And even the livestock have been put in plastic sheds that they are taken care of, and then they are fed the hay. Now, that is different from us. When it is hotter, because the biggest hindrance towards crop productivity in those countries facing the snow and those harsh winters is just the temperature. There is a specific optimum temperature for the maize to grow, for the livestock to be able to thrive. If it does not exist, those crops will not end up growing, or even if they grow, there is what we call in group physiology or animal physiology, they will not be able to do fertilization and then end up procreating, for example, and putting on the seeds, because the temperature has got to be optimum for them to germinate, for them to do fertilization, for them to put on the grains or the flowers, and similarly, the same to our livestock. Now, therefore, the hotter it is, the more favorable the environment for them to do what? To do the agriculture. Now, the hotter it is around our environment, the more variable it is and the more difficult it is for us to produce crops in an optimum manner. So, next slide. As I come to this now specifically in Kenya, these are records from the year 1971 to the 2009. These are the number of people who have been affected by either droughts or floods. There is something in 1981, around 83, 84, 85, 91, 93, around droughts and then the floods. Droughts and the floods. And the numbers are there. This is statistics that we got, and which comes from the Central Bureau of Statistics altogether. In fact, it hasn't even captured everything quite well. We went up to 2009 because that is where we got the data, which is, I'll say, quality data that's reliable, for example. Now, even from the year 2009 to the year 2019 up right now, if we are to extract that and get that data, the variability that is there and the people affected by the extreme events is far much more. Now, what does that mean? Also, you know that the frequency of the droughts has increased in the past 10, previous 20 years. What does that mean? The seasons, or our rainfall seasons, in terms of being variable, rains starting early, and also sometimes the rains ending up, rains starting late in the season and ceasing early, and then a reduced length of growing period is also there. What does that relate to climate change? It is because, ladies and gentlemen, the rains that we have that come and happen in Kenya come about because of, from our geography, the winds will be blowing from the Indian Ocean, carrying what? Carrying moisture. As these winds blow the ocean carrying moisture through a given pattern, as the earth is rotating around the sun altogether, they come from a given direction, and then a time comes with the cloud formation, and then there's a rainfall in a given period. Now, you and I know also from the very basic science of physics that this thing that we call air molecules, what happens when it's hotter? They become more volatile, the air molecules. Those air molecules is what we consider the wind. So if the wind pattern has been such that the winds have been blowing from the Indian Ocean to bring about carrying moisture in a given pattern, because of the increase in temperature, the concentration of the wind in terms of direction, as well as the pathway and carrying the moisture ends up changing. And so, what right now we are witnessing, ladies and gentlemen, even into the future that we are going to, the same will happen. Hence the urgency of us coming up with interventions that are smart, that are climate smart in the different sectors. And this is where you and I need to be able to convey this kind of information to the people, the masses, and the public. Next slide. This is still a historical timeline of major agricultural production shocks in Kenya around the droughts and the El Nino that we mentioned. This graph is the same as the other one. Next. So, what are these indicators of climate change? Next. Go ahead. Yes. Precipitation, that's the rainfall that ends up becoming decreased in some places altogether, sometimes it has increased somewhere. And then increased temperatures, changes in timing of rains. There is in some places increased precipitation or rainfall. It becomes too much. And sometimes rains will fall, for example, 100 millimeters of rainfall will fall in a month, even distributed. You can get that, half of it falling in within 24 hours. That just becomes now leading to the floods. Now, in some places, there is temperature altogether, changes in frequency and intensity of all these, the temperature, the precipitation, the wind velocity, and then the others. Next. So, how are the sectors affected by climate change? In agriculture, the rainfall patterns, increased temperatures, more frequent floods. So, of course, the crop yields, livestock is affected, and food security. How is example, livestock affected by temperature. Something that most people do not know is even when there is that kind of fertilization in crops, for them to put on the grain, they need to have the optimum water available as well as temperature to be available as well as nutrients. If one of them misses, you now get a poor crop. Actually, the same is for livestock. If, for example, the cows are in calf, or the sheep, they are pregnant, I'll say, if the temperature is unsuitable, for example, it can lead to what? A miscarriage. These things happen. Another thing that's happening in livestock health and even crop health is there are emerging pests and diseases, some of which were never there or were not blooming in the previous years. The reason being, with the enhanced carbon dioxide levels that are there, it ends up favoring specific pests and diseases or some kinds of bacteria, and then you get some kind of specific diseases ending up blooming. We didn't have the fall armyworm before. It just came in which years of that? 2015, 2016. It began talking about it. Now, the maize lethal necrosis virus also began around when? That time. Before that, it wasn't quite there altogether, it was quite minimal. Recently, in 2019, just before the COVID, we had what happening in northern Kenya? Desert locusts. Yes, their breeding was favored specifically by these factors. And we have not seen the last of those yet. More are going to thrive. We should be ready for this increased incidence altogether. That's now for livestock. Now, what about the economic impacts? This affects the economy, including agriculture, and of course our tourism and fisheries. What can we do? The media can be able to help us report on how farmers can adapt using different technologies and practices, drought and crops, irrigation, sustainable practices for agriculture, while in economic losses that are there due to natural disasters or the costs of adaptation measures, and even the opportunities for green economic growth, which also has got some specific cost to it. That is something that we need to be able to brainstorm about and talk about. Now, next. Next. Again. This is just pest disease altogether. Go ahead again. We have talked about it already. The floods and we're in for this. Droughts. Go ahead with the next. Water resources. How are they affected by climate change, ladies and gentlemen? It affects the water availability, first and foremost. But then there is something that people don't know or sometimes don't talk about so much. Water will be available, but what about the quality of that water? Is it the right quality for drinking? Is it the right quality for use in the households? So it affects both the quality of the water available as well as the quality of the water. And this is supposed to be documented. So it can lead to water scarcity in some areas altogether, and then something that may have known. In a lot of estates in Nairobi and even elsewhere, what are they doing when people end up putting up houses? They come together because the water providers are not quite providing the water. What do? Sink a borehole. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what is happening to those boreholes during the dry seasons? Dry. What kind of water is coming from those boreholes? Typically, salty water is coming from those boreholes. It has got an effect on our health. And this is something that many people will be aware about, but we have to make it known And then, now, the media is supposed to cover stories around water conservation efforts, about water management strategies, about the impacts of communities relying on water bodies that are there in the rivers, in the lakes, and even groundwater. We are not necessarily utilizing our water well, actually out of wastage, when the reserves are available. And even our water sources are not well, of course, you know what, protected. And that is going to have an impact. I have friends who are in the healthcare ministry. I also have a younger brother who's a medical doctor. And what they say is, many times, when they end up examining patients, they basically say, what have you been eating? What? And someone says, but I've been drinking this water, it's boiled, and I have been keeping these measures. But when you boil the water, the saltiness will not go away altogether. As you take more and more of it, you know what happens in the body? There is an imbalance of even chemicals in the body. And that leads to more sicknesses. These things are there. And now, something that's also there within our environment. You know very well that we have had this mention about diseases. There is the aflatoxin. Many people are not aware about the impacts of this aflatoxin. It is becoming more enhanced. How did it come about? During storage, you get most of this flour and things like products all together and grains getting affected by that problem. And then some people say, oh my goodness, this can only affect the grains. Even after you have ended up milling it, and you put an environment in your own house where there are some damp conditions, and then you realize there's some fungus, you know what? Aflatoxin has crept in. And a number of products, if you sample them from the supermarkets, when you're doing the research, you get all the kinds of flour, all the peanut butters, you get all the products coming out. And then when we do analysis in the laboratories, we realize the levels of aflatoxin, indeed what is in the shelves in supermarkets, is high beyond what is recommended, for example. So we are getting, and you know the thing is, they are buying from the local market. So the thing is, we need to make this awareness created altogether. Climate change, that's biodiversity. Our life habitats, ecosystems, forests and wetlands. The conservation efforts around wildlife migration patterns, habitat loss, and the impact of indigenous species is supposed to be brought to the light. Specifically, wild species is because these indigenous species are the ones that are more adapted, that are more hardy. And even the pharmaceutical industry end up extracting ingredients from these indigenous species to be able to help us get our drugs that we use when we go to hospitals. Next. Energy sector. Changes in climate can affect energy production and distribution. We know that we rely heavily on hydropower in the country. And of course, these are affected by water availability, and you know very well what we go through in this country during the dry periods, and the government is doing its best to be able to import electricity by connecting to the power lines in Ethiopia, in Uganda, and in Tanzania. But of course, the media can cover stories on renewable energy projects that showcase what are the best practices, energy efficiency, and transition to clean energy sources. Very important for us. And then, of course, in the health sector, how climate change contributes to the so-called the spread of the vector-borne diseases like malaria and dengue fever. This is going to continue happening in the future. And therefore, this will exacerbate the respiratory illnesses as well as other consequences altogether, but especially due to air pollution and other extreme weather events. The media can report on public health initiatives, climate health risks altogether, and measures that can be put into place through the healthcare systems. Next. With that, ladies and gentlemen, may I now say this. In the course of time, I'll be able to work with the Kenyatta's Guild and team to come up with and develop a curriculum that can be able to guide on how you can be able to report. Amongst that will be what are the best practices that can be used. Also, which kind of terms can we use for consistency? For example, someone has basically said here, mitigation. The word mitigation is used in climate change to mean removing this greenhouse gas from the atmosphere to come on land. They are not there, that's the term mitigation, for example. But of course, a lot of time people say, to mitigate these effects, that's a mixing of terms, depending on the people that we are addressing, for example. And what's adaptation? It is because the way the climate has changed and increase in temperature, where we are heading to the year 2030, which will affect our Kenya vision 2030, to the year 2050, to the year 2100. If we and the entire world is going to continue producing our products, same way we are doing, we will be in for an increase in temperature into the future. You know what that means? What we are right now seeing as floods and the droughts and the cyclones and all these that are mentioned together, it is simply a warm-up. Ni mchezo. We should prepare for that because it will be more enhanced in the future. We should come up with measures and make it known to our elites, leadership, politicians, and different sectors together about the urgency of dealing with the changing climate, because we